Racist cops arrest a black man at a desolate rest stop. Their power absolute. 24 hours later. That same man, Judge Malcolm Reed, dons his robe. The officers who humiliated him now stand before his bench. Prepare for a shocking courtroom reckoning where justice takes an electrifying, unexpected turn. The late afternoon sun cast long, oppressive shadows across the asphalt of the I-95 rest stop, the air thick with the smell of diesel fumes and wilting summer grass. Judge Malcolm Reed, a man whose life had been dedicated to the precise architecture of law, stretched his legs, the fabric of his tailored suit feeling alien and restrictive after 3 hours behind the wheel. He was on his way back from a judicial conference, his mind still sifting through complex arguments on federal sentencing guidelines, a world away from the simmering tension that was about to engulf him. He'd chosen this particular rest stop for its relative quiet, a brief interlude to clear his head before the final leg of his journey home. As he leaned against his dark sedan, sipping lukewarm water from a bottle, a sense of unease began to prickle at the back of his neck. It wasn't a conscious thought, more an instinct honed from decades of navigating a world that often saw his skin color before his credentials. 3 police officers were making their way across the parking lot, their path an unnervingly straight line towards him. Malcolm straightened, his posture unconsciously shifting from that of a weary traveler to the composed federal judge he was. He offered a polite, almost imperceptible nod as they approached. 2 of the officers were white, their faces impassive, their movements mirroring each other. The third, lagging slightly behind, was also white, younger, with a nervous energy that suggested he was newer to the uniform. But it was the man in the lead, Officer Darren Colton, whose gaze was sharpest, coldest. Colton's name tag was glinting in the sun, his hand resting casually, yet deliberately, on the butt of his holstered sidearm. "Evening," Colton began, his voice flat, devoid of any genuine greeting. He stopped a few feet from Malcolm, his colleagues fanning out slightly, a practiced, subtle flanking maneuver. "This your vehicle?" "Good evening, officers." "Yes, it is," Malcolm replied, his tone even, professional. He'd faced down hostile witnesses and recalcitrant lawyers with less composure than he was summoning now. He knew the script, the unspoken rules of these encounters. "We've had reports of a suspicious individual in this area. Matches your description," Colton stated, his eyes sweeping over Malcolm's expensive suit, his polished shoes, the subtle gold of his watch. The implication was clear. A black man, well-dressed or not, was inherently suspicious in this context. Malcolm felt a familiar weariness settle upon him, the kind that seeped into bones and spirit. Suspicious how? "Officer," he asked, keeping his hands visible, away from his pockets. "I was merely taking a break from driving." "That's for us to determine," Colton retorted, a smirk playing on his lips. "License and registration." It wasn't a request. Malcolm reached slowly into his inner jacket pocket, announcing his movement. "My license and registration are in my wallet in the glove compartment, respectively." He retrieved his wallet, extracting his driver's license. As he handed it over, he made a calculated decision. "I am a federal judge, officer." He said it quietly, not as a demand for special treatment, but as a statement of fact, hoping to inject a measure of reason into the escalating situation. Colton took the license, glanced at it dismissively, then back at Malcolm, his eyes narrowing. "A judge. Huh? Funny, you don't look like a judge to me." The sneer was more pronounced now, the contempt palpable. The other 2 officers exchanged a quick, unreadable glance. The younger one shifted his weight, looking down at his boots. "Appearance can be deceiving, Officer Colton," Malcolm said, his voice a low thrum of carefully controlled anger. "My credentials are in the car, if you require further verification." "Oh, I think we require a bit more than that," Colton said, his voice rising slightly, drawing the attention of a family piling out of a minivan nearby. They froze, eyes wide, a young child clutching a stuffed animal, sensing the charged atmosphere. Turn around, hands on the car. A cold dread, sharp and invasive, pierced through Malcolm's cultivated composure. Officer, for what reason am I being detained? His legal training, his very essence, recoiled at the flagrant disregard for due process. Failure to cooperate, looking like you're about to run. Colton snapped, his hand now firmly on his weapon. And because I said so, now turn around before I make you. The humiliation was a physical force, pressing down on him, stealing the air from his lungs. The eyes of the family, the curious stares from other travelers, burned into his back. This was not a courtroom where logic and evidence held sway. This was raw power, arbitrary and absolute, wielded by a man who saw him not as a judge, not even as a citizen, but as a threat defined by prejudice, with a profound sense of resignation. Malcolm turned, placing his hands on the heated metal of his car roof. The click of the handcuffs as they ratcheted around his wrist was brutally loud in the sudden silence, a sound that echoed a long, painful history he had fought so hard to overcome, both for himself and for others. Colton's search was rough, invasive, his comments laced with sarcasm. What's a fancy judge like you doing carrying so much cash? Huh, planning a big night out. Malcolm remained silent, his jaw clenched. Each pat, each snide remark was a fresh indignity. His briefcase was open, its contents, legal documents, a worn copy of the Constitution, rifled through with casual disrespect. They found his judicial identification. Colton stared at it for a long moment, his face unreadable, before tossing it back into the briefcase. He didn't acknowledge it, didn't apologize. The fact of Malcolm's position seemed only to harden his resolve. Get him in the car, Colton ordered his colleagues. As he was roughly guided towards the police cruiser, the world seemed to tilt. The faces in the crowd were a blur of shock, fear, and a dawning, uncomfortable awareness. He caught the eye of the small child by the minivan, still clutching the toy, its innocent gaze a stark contrast to the ugliness of the moment. It was an image that would sear itself into Malcolm's memory. The back of the police car was cramped, the plastic seat hard and unforgiving, the smell of stale sweat and disinfectant overwhelming. He sat, cuffed and powerless, watching the rest stop recede as they pulled away. Sirens conspicuously silent. There was no explanation. No Miranda rights read, just the grim satisfaction on Colton's face in the rearview mirror. It was an arrest, an abduction, cloaked in the authority of a badge, the weight of that badge, and the prejudice it could shield, had never felt heavier to Malcolm Reed, a man who had dedicated his life to the sanctity of the law. Now it's captive. The journey to the local precinct was a descent into a nightmare he thought he had outrun decades ago. The fight, he knew, was far from over. It was, in a terrible and profound way, just beginning. The stark, fluorescent lights of the local police precinct hum with a monotonous indifference, a stark contrast to the chaotic emotions churning within Malcolm Reed. He was processed with a chilling efficiency, fingerprints smudged onto cards, a mugshot taken against a grimy wall where countless others had stood, their stories absorbed by the stained concrete. His tailored suit, now rumpled and bearing the faint, acrid smell of the police cruiser, felt like a costume from another life. The officers here were different from Colton and his partners, less overtly hostile, more imbued with a weary cynicism that treated every incoming individual as just another piece of unwelcome paperwork. His title of judge, when it eventually emerged from the arrest report, elicited a flicker of surprise from one desk sergeant, quickly masked, but no change in procedure. The system, once engaged, moved with his own impersonal momentum. He was led to a holding cell, the steel door clanging shut with a sound that vibrated deep in his bones, a resonant echo of the handcuffs from hours before. The cell was cold, bare a concrete slab for a bench, a gleaming stainless steel toilet and sink combination in the corner. The air was stale, tinged with the odors of unwashed bodies and despair. As Malcolm sat on the unforgiving bench, the adrenaline that had sustained him through the initial shock of the arrest began to wane, replaced by a profound, chilling clarity. It was in this stark, dehumanizing environment that the past, long compartmentalized but never truly buried, began to surface, not as a flood of emotional overthinking, but as a series of sharp, vivid tableaus replayed in the theater of his mind. He was 17 again, not Judge Malcolm Reed, but simply Mal, a lanky teenager full of nervous excitement, driving his father's meticulously cared for 10-year-old sedan. It was his first time driving solo after dark, a trip to pick up his mother from her late shift as a nurse at the county hospital. He remembered the pride he felt, the sense of burgeoning adulthood. He remembered the flashing blue lights appearing suddenly in his rearview mirror, a predatory bloom in the night. Two officers, their faces obscured by the glare of their flashlights, had approached his father's car. Their questions were aggressive, accusatory. "Where are you going in such a hurry? Boy, whose car is this? You've been drinking." Young Malcolm, respectful but terrified, had tried to explain, his voice cracking. He remembered the driver's side door being yanked open, being dragged out, his cheeks scraping against the rough asphalt as he was pushed face down onto the hood of the car. He hadn't understood. He had done nothing wrong. His father, Arthur Reed, a high school history teacher and a man of immense dignity and quiet strength, had instilled in Malcolm and his sister a deep respect for the law, but also a pragmatic understanding of its potential for misapplication, especially against people who looked like them. He'd taught them to remain calm, to comply, to survive the encounter and fight for justice later, through proper channels. That night, Malcolm had tried to follow that advice, his mind a maelstrom of fear and confusion as the officers ransacked the car, his mother's worn Bible tossed onto the roadside, its pages fluttering in the breeze. They found nothing. Of course, no drugs, no alcohol, no weapons, just a scared teenager in his father's well-maintained vehicle. But the humiliation, the raw terror of being utterly powerless, had been punishment enough. He was eventually let go with a vague warning to drive more carefully, the implication clear that his real offense was being young, black, and in the wrong place at their whim. He never told his father the full extent of the physical roughness, the depth of the verbal abuse. He'd seen the worry in his parents' eyes too many times. Instead, the incident had solidified into a cold, hard knot of resolve in his young chest. It wasn't a desire for revenge that took root, but a burning need to understand the system that allowed such an injustice, and to change it from within. He'd devoured books on law, on civil rights, on the history of the very nation that proclaimed liberty and justice for all, yet so often failed to deliver it to all its citizens. That night was the silent catalyst. It steered him away from a fleeting interest in engineering towards the daunting, uphill path of law. He'd excelled, driven by a quiet fury, earning a scholarship to a prestigious law school. He'd then dedicated years to a small, underfunded civil rights practice, fighting battles that often seemed unwinnable, chipping away at the monolith of systemic prejudice. One case, one life at a time, he'd learned to channel the pain of his own experiences and the inherited pain of his community into a meticulous, unyielding pursuit of accountability. His appointment to the federal bench had felt like a culmination, a chance to ensure the law was applied with the fairness and impartiality he had been denied that night, and that so many others were still denied. The irony of his current situation was a bitter pill. Here he was, a federal judge, incarcerated in a local jail, a victim of the very same arbitrary abuse of power he had fought against his entire adult life. His composure at the rest stop, his measured responses to Officer Colton, were not born of meekness or an acceptance of his fate. They were the hard-won discipline of a survivor, a strategist who knew that the initial confrontation was rarely the decisive one. He understood the insidious nature of provocation, how easily a display of anger, however justified, could be twisted and used against him. He had remained silent then, not out of fear, but out of a deep-seated knowledge of how to navigate these treacherous waters, preserving his dignity and his options. A guard's footsteps echoed outside the cell, a brief rap on the door. "Lawyer's here to see you." "Reed?" Malcolm stood, smoothing down his basket as best he could. The fight was indeed just beginning, but it was a fight he had unknowingly been preparing for his entire life. The echoes of that roadside humiliation years ago no longer just resonated with pain. They now amplified a steely determination. The system had failed him then, and it had failed him now. But Malcolm Reed was not just a victim, he was a judge, and he knew the law. More importantly, he knew its potential, and he would not rest until its promise was brought to bear on those who had so brazenly defiled it. The cold concrete of the cell felt a little less oppressive, the hum of the fluorescent lights a little less mocking. The past was not just a burden, it was his armor. The release from the local precinct the following morning was as unceremonious as the arrest had been brutal. Malcolm's lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney named Elena Ramirez, whom he'd known since his civil rights days, had worked through the night. The charges, resisting arrest and failure to cooperate, were flimsy, almost laughably so, given the circumstances and Malcolm's status. Yet, they remained, a stain on his record, a bureaucratic weapon hanging over him. The arresting officers, notably Colton, were nowhere to be seen. Malcolm stepped out into the bright, unforgiving sunlight, the air of freedom tasting metallic and unsatisfying. He was free, but the injustice clung to him like the cheap scent of the holding cell. News of a federal judge's arrest, even for minor, questionable charges, had begun to seep into the local media ecosystem. Initially as hushed rumors, then as tentative online blurbs, Elena had been fielding calls, trying to control the narrative. But the undercurrent was already there, the subtle implication that where there was smoke, there must be fire. The system, Malcolm knew, had ways of grinding a person down. Even someone of his standing, his immediate concern was his judicial duties. He contacted Chief Judge Marion Ashworth, a woman he respected, who had been a mentor of sorts. Ashworth's reaction was a carefully calibrated blend of shock and official concern. "Malcolm, this is deeply troubling," she'd said over the secure line, her voice betraying a hint of strain. "I trust you'll handle this with the utmost discretion. The integrity of the bench is paramount." Discretion. The word hung in the air. Malcolm understood. He was expected to make this go away quietly, to not let his personal indignity cast a shadow on the institution. But how could he? The arrest wasn't just a personal affront, it was a symptom of a deeper malaise, the very kind he'd sworn to combat. The initial hearing for his own charges was scheduled with alarming speed, a small, local courtroom, a world away from the federal chambers where he presided. He appeared not as Judge Reed, but as Malcolm Reed, defendant. The prosecutor, a young, ambitious man named Peterson, treated him with a veneer of professional courtesy that barely masked a predatory glint in his eyes. He saw a high-profile case, a chance to make a name. Officer Colton and his two colleagues were present, sitting ramrod straight, their expressions carefully neutral. Colton, however, couldn't entirely suppress a flicker of triumph as his gaze met Malcolm's. Elena argued forcefully for an immediate dismissal, citing the lack of credible evidence and the clear prejudice involved. "This was not an arrest, Your Honor," she stated, her voice ringing with conviction. "It was an abduction under the color of law." The local judge, a man named Henderson, listened, his face a study in judicial impassivity. He seemed more concerned with the unusual media presence in his usually quiet courtroom than with the substance of the arguments. After a brief recess, he delivered his ruling. While the circumstances surrounding the arrest raise questions, there is, on the surface, enough of a report from the officers to proceed. I will set a date for a preliminary hearing. Bail is continued. It was a small procedural defeat, but it felt monumental. The system was legitimizing the charade. Malcolm watched Colton's subtle smirk and felt a cold anger solidify within him. This was how it worked: the slow, anemic crawl of due process, designed to wear down the accused, to make even the innocent crave a plea bargain just to end the ordeal. In the days that followed, Malcolm attempted to resume his duties on the federal bench, but the incident cast a long shadow. Lawyers in his courtroom seemed to scrutinize him differently. He sensed a new hesitation in their arguments, a subtle questioning in their eyes. Was he compromised? Was he now a target? The covert discrimination was not in overt statements, but in the changed atmosphere. The slightly too formal greetings, the careful avoidance of any topic remotely related to policing or arrests. He was still Judge Reed, but he was also Malcolm Reed, the arrested, one afternoon. A sensitive case involving allegations of police misconduct against a minority defendant came across his desk for assignment. Typically, such cases were distributed randomly or by rotation. Chief Judge Ashworth called him into her chambers. "Malcolm," she began, her tone gentle but firm. "Regarding the Henderson County case, perhaps it would be prudent for you to recuse yourself." "Prudent, Marion? Or are you suggesting I am incapable of impartiality?" Malcolm's voice was low, but the challenge was unmistakable. "Of course not," Ashworth replied, a little too quickly. "But given your recent experience, there could be an appearance of bias. The media is already circling. We need to protect the court from any suggestion of impropriety." The gilded cage. He was being asked to step aside, not because of any actual failing on his part, but because the system that had wronged him now sought to use that wrong as a reason to sideline him. His own victimization was being weaponized to limit his judicial power. The exploitation was subtle, couched in the language of ethics and institutional integrity. But it was exploitation nonetheless. "So, the officers who arrested me without cause continue their duties, while I, the victim of their actions, am asked to step away from mine to avoid an appearance of bias." Malcolm's gaze was unwavering. Ashworth sighed, the sound heavy with the weight of her office. "It's a temporary measure, Malcolm. Until your own legal matters are resolved, it's for the best." "For the best of whom?" "Marion," he asked quietly, but he knew the answer. It was for the best of a system that prioritized its own image over individual justice. He didn't recuse himself immediately. He reviewed the Henderson County case file meticulously. The parallels to his own experience were chilling, though the defendant in that case lacked his resources. His platform, the systemic nature of the exploitation, became painfully clear. It wasn't just about individual bad apples like Colton. It was about a system that enabled, protected, and then insulated itself from the consequences of their actions. A few days later, a pivotal piece of information landed on Elena Ramirez's desk. A sharp intern, sifting through public records, had discovered a pattern. Officer Darren Colton had a statistically significant number of suspicious person stops and arrests involving minority individuals, particularly black men, in situations where charges were later dropped or dismissed for lack of evidence. Many of these had occurred at rest or during routine traffic encounters. There were no official reprimands on his record, just a steady accumulation of incidents that, individually, might seem minor, but collectively painted a disturbing picture. "This isn't just about you anymore, Malcolm," Elena said, her eyes bright with a lawyer's fire. "This is a pattern. Colton is a predator with a badge." The information was a spark in the suffocating darkness of the previous weeks. It was tangible, something he could fight with. But as he prepared for his own upcoming preliminary hearing, he knew the battle was uphill. He was trying to move forward, to continue his life's work. But the tendrils of the unjust arrest, and the systemic biases it represented, were coiling around him, attempting to drag him down into a morass of procedural delays and professional marginalization. The realization that even his position offered only a fragile shield against such forces was a sobering one. The true test was yet to come. The weeks leading up to Malcolm Reed's preliminary hearing were a suffocating blend of legal maneuvering and quiet dread. Elena Ramirez was a whirlwind of activity, meticulously dissecting the arresting officer's statements, cross-referencing them with Colton's newly uncovered history of questionable stops. Yet, despite the emerging pattern, the official narrative held firm. Officer Colton and his colleagues had filed supplementary reports, subtly embellishing Malcolm's alleged agitation and uncooperative demeanor at the rest stop, painting a picture of a man who, regardless of his profession, had behaved suspiciously and disrespectfully towards a law enforcement. The system was closing ranks. Malcolm threw himself into the preparation, his judicial mind dissecting his own case with a chilling objectivity. He reviewed every document, every potential angle, the gnawing injustice fueling a cold, precise anger. He felt the walls of the gilded cage Chief Judge Ashworth had spoken of pressing in. He was still presiding over cases. But the weight of his own unresolved charges, the implicit threat to his career, was a constant, unwelcome companion. The subtle ostracization continued. 1,000 paper cuts to his professional standing. He knew that simply winning his own case, getting the charges dropped, wouldn't be enough. That would be a personal victory, but the systemic rot that allowed a man like Colton to flourish would remain untouched. One late afternoon, as Malcolm and Elena were holed up in his home office, surrounded by stacks of legal files and lukewarm coffee, Elena's phone buzzed. She glanced at the unknown number, a frown creasing her brow, and answered with her usual brisk professionalism. Malcolm watched as her expression shifted, from cautious to intrigued, then to a focused intensity. She listened more than she spoke, jotting down quick notes, her eyes occasionally flicking towards him. "Yes, I understand," Elena said finally, her voice softer than usual. "Yes, he's here. Of course, thank you for calling. It takes courage." She ended the call, looking at Malcolm with a spark he hadn't seen in days. "That was a woman named Sarah Bellamy," Elena began, leaning forward. "She was at the rest stop, with her husband and 2 young children. She saw the whole thing. Malcolm, everything." Malcolm straightened, a flicker of something akin to hope, or perhaps just renewed fight, igniting within him. And she's been tormented by it ever since," Elena continued. "Apparently, her 7-year-old daughter keeps asking about the sad man the police were mean to. She saw the initial, very brief news reports about your arrest. She didn't know you were a judge until then. She said she and her husband debated contacting someone, but they were scared. Worried about repercussions, about getting involved." "What changed her mind?" Malcolm asked, his voice quiet. "She said she teaches her children that silence in the face of wrongdoing is a form of complicity," Elena relayed, a small, weary smile on her face. "Took her a while, but her conscience won. She's not a legal expert, doesn't know what's important, but she remembers Officer Colton's exact words when he first approached you. Before you'd said more than a polite greeting, she said he was immediately aggressive, told you that you fit the description of someone causing trouble. She's clear that you were calm, respectful, and that the escalation came entirely from him. It was a small crack of light in a very dark room. Sarah Bellamy's testimony wouldn't, on its own, dismantle the police narrative, but it was a contemporaneous, civilian account directly contradicting Colton's claims of Malcolm's initial belligerence. It was a piece of the truth, untainted by institutional loyalty. "She didn't happen to record anything, did she?" Malcolm asked. Though he knew it was a long shot, Elena shook her head. "No," she said, "everything happened too fast, and she was primarily focused on shielding her kids. But she's willing to provide a sworn affidavit. More importantly, she's willing to testify." This was the unexpected aid, not from a legal loophole or a powerful ally, but from an ordinary citizen moved by a simple, profound sense of right and wrong. It was a reminder that the community, so often a silent backdrop to these dramas, had a voice. The arrival of Sarah Bellamy's account, coupled with the pattern evidence against Colton, acted as a catalyst for Malcolm. The strategy of quiet defense, of waiting for the system to self-correct, was clearly failing. The chief judge's advice about discretion now felt less like wisdom and more like an encouragement to accept his own effacement. He looked at Elena, a new resolve hardening his gaze. We're not just going to defend against these charges anymore. Elena, he stated, his voice devoid of its earlier weariness, now imbued with a steely command that usually resonated in his courtroom. We're going on the offensive. This isn't just about my arrest. It's about Officer Colton's documented pattern of abuse of authority and racial profiling. It's about the department that allows it. Elena's eyes lit up. What are you proposing? First, we file a comprehensive motion to compel discovery of Colton's full internal affairs record, not just the sanitized version they'll offer. We cite the pattern we've established, and we attach Mrs. Bellamy's affidavit as corroborating evidence of his modus operandi. Malcolm began pacing his office, the energy of a courtroom advocate reawakening within him. Second, we file a formal misconduct complaint against Officer Colton and his partners with the Office of Professional Responsibility and, significantly, with the Department of Justice, citing a pattern and practice of civil rights violations. This was a bold move. It was no longer just about Malcolm Reed, the defendant. It was Judge Malcolm Reed leveraging his understanding of the law to launch a direct challenge against a problematic officer and, by implication, his department. It was the first stone cast, not in anger, but with precision and intent. That will send shockwaves, Malcolm, Elena cautioned. Though there was excitement in her voice, the local PD will fight tooth and nail. The prosecutor's office will see it as an attack. Let them, Malcolm replied. The truth has a way of creating its own disturbances. We've been operating under the assumption that the system desires fairness. It's time to operate under the assumption that it requires active, unyielding pressure to achieve it. Over the next few days, they worked relentlessly. Sarah Bellamy, true to her word, provided a detailed, compelling affidavit, her memory of the incident sharp and her indignation palpable even on paper. The motion they drafted was a legal broadside, meticulously detailing Colton's history, referencing similar cases, and framing Malcolm's arrest not as an isolated incident, but as the predictable outcome of unchecked bias. The filing of the motion and the misconduct complaints was done without fanfare, but the documents themselves were explosive. They knew it was only a matter of time before the media picked up on the true scope of the challenge. This was Malcolm's first overt act of resistance, a declaration that he would not be a passive victim. He was using the tools of the law, not just to defend himself, but to begin the arduous process of holding power accountable. The immediate effect was a chilling silence from the prosecutor's office. No response to calls, no customary professional dialogue. It was the quiet before a storm. Malcolm knew he had crossed a threshold. He had moved from being the accused to being the accuser, and in doing so, he had significantly raised the stakes for everyone involved. The preliminary hearing, once a source of dread, now felt like the first skirmish in a much larger battle he was finally, fully prepared to wage. The unexpected courage of Sarah Bellamy had reminded him that he was not alone, and that the fight for justice often found its strength in the most unassuming of places. The atmosphere in Judge Henderson's courtroom was electric, a stark contrast to its usually somnolent state. Malcolm Reed's preliminary hearing had transformed from a minor local judicial proceeding into a focal point for a much larger, simmering discontent. The news of his audacious legal filings against Officer Colton and the police department had spread like wildfire, drawing a crowd that spilled out into the hallway. Media crews jostled for position, their cameras aimed like artillery. Activists, both local and some from further afield, filled the public benches, their expressions a mixture of grim anticipation and defiant hope. Malcolm sat beside Elena Ramirez, a bastion of calm in the swirling currents of expectation, his face betraying nothing of the maelstrom he had unleashed. Prosecutor Peterson, looking somewhat harried by the intense scrutiny, launched into his opening statement, his voice tight. He painted a picture of diligent officers responding to a legitimate concern, met by an uncooperative, agitated individual who happened to be, regrettably, a judge. He emphasized Officer Colton's years of service, his commendations, carefully omitting any mention of the complaints Malcolm and Elena had unearthed. Officer Darren Colton was Peterson's first witness. He strode to the stand with a practiced confidence, his uniform immaculate, his gaze sweeping coolly over the courtroom before settling on Peterson. He recounted his version of the arrest, his testimony a well-rehearsed narrative of escalating suspicion and necessary action. He described Malcolm as evasive, argumentative, and claimed by Malcolm's announcement of his judicial status was delivered aggressively, as if expecting special treatment. Under Peterson's gentle questioning, Colton portrayed himself as a patient, professional officer forced to make a difficult decision in the face of perceived defiance. Then it was Elena Ramirez's turn. She approached the witness stand with a quiet intensity, a folder clutched in her hand. The courtroom held its breath. "Officer Colton," Elena began, her voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "You testified that my client, Judge Reed, was agitated and uncooperative from the outset of your interaction at the rest stop. Is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am. He seemed nervous, wouldn't make eye contact, kept questioning my authority," Colton replied, his tone firm. "And it was this agitation, this alleged lack of cooperation, that led you to believe he was suspicious and ultimately to arrest him." "Among other factors, yes. His demeanor was not consistent with an innocent person simply taking a break." Colton's gaze flickered towards Malcolm, a hint of disdain in his eyes. Elena nodded slowly. "Officer Colton, are you familiar with Sarah Bellamy?" A barely perceptible tightening around Colton's mouth. The name, I might have seen it on a list. "She was a witness at the rest stop, officer, with her husband and 2 small children. She has provided a sworn affidavit stating that Judge Reed was calm and polite, and that you, Officer Colton, were aggressive and accusatory from the moment you approached him, before he had said more than, 'Good evening.' Is Mrs. Bellamy lying?" Officer Peterson shot to his feet. "Objection, hearsay counsel is testifying." "Sustained on the hearsay," Judge Henderson said, looking annoyed. "Ms. Ramirez, you know better." "My apologies, Your Honor. Let me rephrase," Elena said, unfazed. "Officer Colton, would it surprise you to learn that a civilian witness, with no connection to Judge Reed, describes your initial demeanor as hostile and Judge Reed's as entirely cooperative?" Colton shifted in his seat. "People see what they want to see. My report, and those of my fellow officers, are accurate." Elena then moved, meticulously, through Colton's history of suspicious person stops, the ones Malcolm's team had uncovered. With each question about a specific past incident, "Do you recall stopping a Mr. David Henderson for looking suspicious at a gas station?" Charges later dropped. "Do you recall detaining Ms. Aaliyah Jones for loitering when she was waiting for a bus?" Case dismissed. Colton grew visibly more irritated, his answers becoming clipped, his confident facade beginning to crack. Peterson objected repeatedly. But Elena, citing the relevance to establish a pattern of bias and modus operandi in this specific arrest, managed to get much of it on the record, or at least into the minds of those present. The tension in the courtroom was a palpable entity. Malcolm watched, his expression unchanged, but inside the man, a grim satisfaction was stirring. This was the public airing the system resisted. Then Elena played her ace. "Your Honor," she announced, her voice resonating with sudden power, "through our discovery motions, the prosecution was compelled to release all body-worn camera footage from the officers present at Judge Reed's arrest. Initially, we were provided with footage only from Officer Colton's camera, which, conveniently, only begins recording after Judge Reed is already against his vehicle. However, further diligent inquiry revealed that Officer Miller, the junior officer present, also had his camera activated. This footage, Your Honor, was not initially disclosed. We received it only late yesterday." A wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Peterson's face went pale. Officer Miller, sitting behind Colton, stared rigidly ahead. "We have cued Officer Miller's footage to the beginning of the encounter." Elena continued, gesturing to a technician who had set up a large monitor. With the court's permission, I would like to play it. Judge Henderson, his expression now stern and intrigued, looked at Peterson. Mr. Peterson, any reason this footage wasn't provided in the initial discovery dump? Peterson stammered. Your Honor, it was an oversight, a clerical error. The footage is substantially similar. Let's see for ourselves, shall we? Henderson said, his voice dry. Proceed, Mr. Ramirez. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly. The screen flickered to life. The audio was clear. It showed the three officers approaching Malcolm's car. It showed Malcolm offering a polite nod. And then, Officer Colton's voice, sharp and aggressive. Before Malcolm had uttered more than 2 words, "All right, pal. What are you doing here? We've had reports of someone matching your description causing trouble. Let's see some ID now." The footage continued. It showed Malcolm calmly stating his name, explaining he was taking a break. It showed him offering his license. It showed him, respectfully, stating he was a federal judge. And it showed Colton's derisive response. "A judge, huh? Funny, you don't look like a judge to me." Crucially, it showed Malcolm's hands clearly visible, his posture non-threatening, a stark contradiction to Colton's testimony of an agitated, evasive suspect. The escalation, the aggression, was undeniably, visibly, coming from Colton. The moment Colton ordered Malcolm to turn and be cuffed, based on no discernible provocation, was damning. When the footage ended and the lights came up, a stunned silence gripped the courtroom. Officer Colton was ashen-faced, his eyes wide, his earlier confidence completely shattered. He stared at the blank screen as if it were a basilisk. Prosecutor Peterson looked like he'd been physically struck, shuffling at his papers, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Elena Ramirez stood tall. "Officer Colton," her voice rang out, clear and cold. "Does Officer Miller's body camera also see what it wants to see, or does it? Perhaps show the truth of your unprovoked aggression and abuse of authority against Judge Malcolm Reed." Colton opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked to Peterson for help, but the prosecutor was still reeling. "No further questions for this witness at this time, Your Honor," Elena stated, returning to her seat beside Malcolm. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had been violently inverted. The undeniable, objective evidence of the body cam footage, initially suppressed, had demolished the police narrative. The witnesses in the courtroom, the media, the activists, the ordinary citizens, had seen it with their own eyes. Judge Henderson's face was a mask of thunder. He stared at Officer Colton, then at Prosecutor Peterson, his disapproval radiating through the courtroom. "Mr. Peterson," Judge Henderson said, his voice dangerously low, "this court is deeply concerned by what it has just witnessed. Not only the content of this footage, but the circumstances of its late disclosure. We will take a recess. I expect a damn good explanation when we return." And Officer Colton, he added, his gaze fixing the visibly shaken officer, "You remain under oath." As Judge Henderson swept from the bench, the courtroom erupted. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. Officer Colton sat frozen on the witness stand for a moment before being hastily escorted out by a court officer, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning fear. Malcolm Reed remained seated, watching the chaos unfold, the first true glimmers of justice beginning to pierce through the oppressive clouds of the preceding weeks. The unblinking eye of truth had been forced open, and its gaze was squarely on those who had sought to corrupt it. The recess stretched into an hour, then 2. Behind closed doors, Judge Henderson's chambers were reportedly the scene of a legal firestorm. When court reconvened, the atmosphere was thick with an almost unbearable tension. Prosecutor Peterson, visibly chastened, rose to address the bench. His earlier bluster was gone, replaced by a strained formality. "Your Honor," Peterson began, his voice low and devoid of conviction. "After careful review of all available evidence, including the newly presented body camera footage from Officer Miller, and in consultation with my superiors. The state has determined that it cannot meet its burden of proof in this matter. Therefore, Your Honor, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Malcolm Reed. A collective gasp, followed by a wave of excited murmurs, swept through the courtroom. Elena Ramirez placed a reassuring hand on Malcolm's arm, though his expression remained stoic, watchful. Judge Henderson's gaze was like granite. Mr. Peterson. While the state's belated recognition of the facts is noted, this court finds the circumstances leading to this dismissal profoundly disturbing. The initial withholding of Officer Miller's body camera footage, which directly contradicted Officer Colton's sworn testimony and the basis for this entire prosecution, borders on prosecutorial misconduct and obstruction of justice. This court will be referring the matter of the suppressed evidence to the State Bar for review. Peterson visibly flinched. The career he had sought to build on this case was now teetering on the brink. As for the charges against Mr. Reed, Henderson continued, his voice rising to command the room, they are hereby dismissed with prejudice. He banged his gavel, the sound echoing with finality. Mr. Reed, you are free to go, and you leave this courtroom with your reputation and integrity unequivocally intact. A spontaneous eruption of applause and cheers filled the courtroom. Activists rose to their feet, some with tears in their eyes. Reporters scribbled furiously. Malcolm Reed finally allowed a small, weary smile to touch his lips. He stood, shook Elena's hand firmly, and then, in a gesture that spoke volumes, he turned to the packed gallery and gave a single, solemn nod. It was an acknowledgement, a thank you, a promise. The fallout from that hearing was swift and seismic. Officer Darren Colton was immediately suspended pending an internal affairs investigation, which, now under the glare of intense public and media scrutiny, as well as pressure from the Department of Justice inquiry Malcolm had initiated, promised to be far more rigorous than any previous review of his conduct. Officer Miller, for his part, reportedly began cooperating fully with investigators, his clerical error defense regarding the footage quickly crumbling. The other officer present at the arrest also found himself under investigation. The police chief issued a carefully worded public apology to Judge Reed, promising departmental reforms and renewed training on de-escalation and bias awareness. Few were convinced it was anything more than damage control, but it was a start. Sarah Bellamy, the reluctant witness whose courage had provided a crucial human element to the legal battle, became an unlikely local hero. Her quiet determination to speak truth to power resonated deeply within the community. She found herself an unintentional symbol of civic responsibility, her story inspiring others to come forward with their own experiences of police misconduct. For Malcolm Reed, the dismissal of charges was not an end, but a new beginning. The public confrontation had irrevocably flipped the power dynamic. He was no longer just a judge. He was a symbol of resilience, of the fight against systemic injustice, and of the power of truth when wielded with courage and precision. Chief Judge Marion Ashworth, who had previously counseled discretion, now publicly lauded Malcolm's unwavering commitment to justice both on and off the bench. She quietly assigned him the Henderson County Police misconduct case he had previously been urged to recuse himself from, a tacit admission of her earlier misjudgment and a clear vote of confidence. This media coverage was extensive, framing Malcolm's ordeal and subsequent vindication as a landmark moment. Op-eds lauded his courage, not just in fighting his own case, but in simultaneously challenging the systemic issues that led to his arrest. Documentaries were proposed. Law schools invited him to speak. He handled the newfound attention with his characteristic dignity and measured composure, always redirecting the focus from his personal suffering to the larger principles at stake. He didn't shy away from the spotlight, but used it. He spoke at community forums, his voice resonating with the authority of his office and the authenticity of his experience. He advocated for stronger civilian oversight of police departments, for better training, for an end to qualified immunity that so often shielded officers like Colton from accountability. He didn't just talk about change, he began to actively shape it. working with community leaders, civil rights organizations, and even reform-minded elements within law enforcement. The case of Judge Malcolm Reed versus the system that had tried to swallow him became a rallying cry. It exposed the fault lines of prejudice and power, but also illuminated the pathways to resistance and reform. The legal battle had been brutal, the personal cost significant, but the outcome had reverberated far beyond the confines of that local courtroom. Months later, as Judge Malcolm Reed sat on the federal bench, presiding over a complex civil rights case, he looked out at the courtroom. He saw young lawyers, their faces earnest and determined. He saw citizens in the gallery, watching the proceedings with an engagement that perhaps hadn't been there before. The scales of justice, he knew, were not self-balancing. They required constant, vigilant pressure from those dedicated to its true and impartial application. His arrest at the rest stop, the humiliation, the cold cell, the subtle and overt attempts to silence and sideline him. These experiences had not broken him. They had forged him anew. He had faced the abyss, and instead of being consumed, he had forced it to confront its own reflection in the unblinking eye of truth. The gavel in his hand felt heavier now, not with the weight of his own ordeal, but with the profound responsibility to ensure that what happened to him would happen to no one else, and that the promise of justice for all was not just a hallowed phrase, but a lived reality. Judge Malcolm Reed had become more than a judge. He had become a guardian of that promise, a symbol of change. His story a testament to the enduring power of one individual's courage to awaken a community and bend the arc of the moral universe, however slightly, towards justice.